Welcome to the All Out Leadership Podcast, hosted by Pastor Eric Lawson, where each episode is uniquely designed to help you live all out by bringing you practical leadership from a biblical perspective delivered in 10 minutes or less. So whether you're a business leader, serving in ministry, or simply looking to grow in your leadership, this podcast is for you. Before we dive into this week's topic, make sure to subscribe to the podcast and download the show notes at ericlawson.com/podcast. And while you're at it, feel free to share the content on social media. Now, let's join Pastor Eric for this week's conversation.
Welcome to another All Out Leadership Podcast. We are talking about David and the 5 enemies of success that we all encounter on the path. We're looking at that the enemies tend to be within our own camp. They're not the enemy that we would think, especially if you're a Christian. What you're going to find that most of these are other Christians or so-called Christians or barely Christians that seem to be coming against us. So we saw that the first one is you'll always have some enemy along the way that's above you, some type of authority figure that's throwing spears at you, like Saul was throwing spears at David. David played harp. Saul threw spears. And so we saw that David behaved himself wisely, and we see that one of the things he did that was wise was how he processed his pain, his frustration. We saw last week that he processed first. Before processing with others, he processed up with God. That's many of the Psalms, our leaders processing their pain, being brutally honest with God about what they feel. We're going to continue with the next step of how to process our pain. 1 Samuel chapter 19, verse 18. So David fled and escaped, and he went to Samuel at Ramah and told him all that Saul had done to him. And he and Samuel went to stay at Noath. Now it was told Saul, saying, take note, David is at Noath in Ramah. Notice this. The second thing that David did is he processed up with a leader. It's okay to process up with the right leaders inside of your life who can be part of the solution. Samuel was a spiritual leader, a mentor, a pastor, so to speak, in the life of David. And so David went to his spiritual mentor, spiritual leader, the one who'd actually anointed him and called him into ministry, who had been advising him in all this time. He went back to him, and Samuel gave him great advice. Samuel encouraged him in the Lord. So find those spiritual leaders who you can process up with. And again, you got to be very careful where you process your pain, because if you process with somebody who's not part of the solution, or you don't process up with an authority figure, it's a thing called gossip. Gossip is talking to people beside you or below you who aren't part of the solution. There was a rabbi who had a man inside of a synagogue who had gotten offended at this rabbi. And so he began to talk about the rabbi to people in the city, in the village, and kind of just spread little rumors about the rabbi. And one day, the man felt sorry for what he did, realized it was wrong that he was gossiping about the rabbi. So he went back to the rabbi and he apologized. He said, sir, this is what I did. Would you please forgive me? And he goes, I know what you did, because it came back to me and I've heard what you've been saying. And I'm going to be honest, it hurt, but I do forgive you. And so the man said, is there anything I could do to make it up to you? And the rabbi said, yes, there is. Take this pillow. And so the rabbi went into a room and grabbed a pillow. It was a big down, fluffy pillow full of like goose feathers. And he said, take this pillow, go out into the town square and tear it open and take the feathers and throw them out up into the air and then come back and see me. So the young man did that, and it was a gusty day, and he tore that pillow open and threw all the feathers up in the air, and they blew in all kinds of different directions all over the town, all over the village. So the young man came back to the rabbi, and he said, sir, I did what you asked. Now what should I do? And he said, now I want you to go back, and I want you to pick up every one of those feathers and put those back in the pillow. He said, sir, that would be impossible. How could I find those all? And he goes, that's exactly what gossip does. When you throw up into the air somebody's reputation and you say something about them, the winds of gossip spread them everywhere, and it's impossible to take it back. Gossip inside of the Bible is actually a really large sin. In fact, when you look inside of Proverbs, it says there's 6 things God hates. 7th is an abomination. And the 7th thing God hates, and this is like above murder, this is above all kinds of things. God says the 7th thing that he calls an abomination is this: one who sows discord among his brethren. In the Jewish culture, gossip was frowned upon as equal to murder, and here's why. Gossip is the equivalent of murdering somebody's reputation. Because whatever you say about that person is what that person becomes in the eyes of somebody else. And what happens is you've now tarnished that person's reputation, and now that person basically becomes dead to other people in terms of they can no longer influence somebody else because they can't hear from that person now because they heard whatever it was you said. Basically, you murdered their reputation. As a pastor, this happens frequently to pastors. So somebody gets offended inside of a church, they walk out and they go, oh man, da-da-da-da, and they spread a rumor and they say something. What happened is they murdered that pastor's reputation to that person who tells that person who tells that person. And now what's happened is that pastor's reputation is dead to that 5, 10, dozen, or 100 people who now have a negative view of that pastor. And so here's what's unfortunate. Maybe God wanted to use that pastor in some way to help those families come to Christ or help their marriage or help them grow in their walk with Christ. And they can no longer receive from that pastor because that gossip that was shared. It's not just pastors, it's with other people. There's people that you could have been friends with, people that could have been life-giving relationships, but you can't receive from them now because you received a word of gossip about them. And so when you process your pain, you need to make sure that you're processing up with leaders. The temptation is we want to process beside us and we want to process below us, and they're not part of the solution. So make sure you're processing in the right place. Next, we see David not only processed up, but then this is a safe place that he did process that would be a sideways relationship that is okay. And we see this, 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 1. Then David fled from Noeth and Ramah and went and said to Jonathan, what have I done? What is my iniquity? And what is my sin before your father that he seeks my life? He went to a covenant friend who could be part of the solution. Because of David's relationship with Saul, and because David and Jonathan were covenant brothers, he went to a safe place that was the right place because Jonathan was inside of this situation and could be part of the solution. So that is an okay place to do. Who are your covenant brothers and sisters who are part of the solution that can help you? And we see that Jonathan strengthened David and gave him perspective to help him process this particular pain. So when you have an enemy above you, the key is this: behave yourself wisely, process 3 healthy ways. Number 1, we process up first with God, process up with the right leader, and number 3, process with a covenant friend. All right, we'll see you next week as we get into enemy number 2, and that is the enemies below you that you will encounter, the Absaloms in your life on your journey to God's best. See you next week.
Thank you for joining us on the All Out Leadership Podcast. We hope you gained new biblical insight that challenged you to grow in your leadership. If you've enjoyed this week's episode, we would love your help in getting the content out farther. You can help by subscribing to the podcast at ericlawson.com/podcast and telling others about it. Next week, Pastor Eric will be back with another episode. So until then, we hope you have a great week being an all-out leader.